What I want to do today is finally get this done, kind of the longer review for Plato's The Republic. Now I have my notes, you can kind of see them right here. Talking about Plato a little bit, not something that I've really ever done too much before, or even like really looked, when I was in college, I didn't do a ton of ancient history classes. I've heard, obviously, everybody's heard about Plato, but something that I've never really looked into a whole lot. And I read this book in college, but obviously, I was a college student. I was a freshman in college in a philosophy class that I was taking as a general study. So I didn't retain much of this. Besides the allegory of the cave, I've always really liked the allegory of the cave, which is in here. Now, a little bit about Plato, which, again, I think this is really interesting, especially these guys, like Socrates, Aristotle, Plato. Um, just an interesting time period because we don't really know, a lot about these people. I think it's one of those things that it is so interesting to me, and I know some people don't like this aspect of history the further back you go because it's not as well documented or set in stone as some other things are. But with Plato, I learned some pretty cool stuff. So he was born around 428. He died 348 BCE, both in Athens. He traveled a lot. He lived in some different places, but he started and ended his life in Athens. And that's just his home. You can tell, like I could tell at least while I was going through this, exactly that was, he liked being there. He traveled, but this is where he did a lot of his work. This is part of the that I knew, is that he was a student of Socrates, that he hung out in this kind of group, this gang that hung out with Socrates. He was one of his students. And what I didn't know is that this group of guys around Socrates are actually these are the ones that actually wrote most of what we know about Socrates, that he didn't ever really write anything down. And I thought that was really interesting. That was something I'd never seen before. And then Plato is actually the teacher of Aristotle. So we have these three incredibly well-known Greek philosophers, or the kind of these ancient philosophers. And they all like follow each other in sequence, and they all knew each other. They knew one, and it's this really, I kind of think it's this really cool, interesting line of how these ideas develop. He was born to a very like kind of well-off aristocratic family, and one especially about this book that I find kind of funny is some of the characters. So this is about kind of this fake conversation that Socrates had 50 years prior, is what Plato's kind of looking at here. And two of the characters, Glaucon and Etemontus, are actually his brother's names. So he uses them in this book. And I thought that was really interesting. Again, not something that I knew. This is why I like doing this, because I learn a ton before I make these videos. He's in this circle, so just kind of outside of the family aspect of this, because again, his family was pretty well off, pretty affluent, aristocratic, distinguished family in Athens. But he starts hanging around with this group of people, these group of students around Socrates, and this is where he develops a lot of his beliefs, kind of these philosophical viewpoints that he talks about later on, especially like this one. This is Plato's book, but it centers around Socrates as kind of the main character, the main person in this that's talking and developing these ideologies, like the philosopher king, the rulers, the tyrant, the oligarch, the democrat, and then so on and so forth, that it's a conversation with Socrates and then three other people. Now, Socrates was eventually tried and executed. He kind of fell out of favor within the city. They all decided, they voted to basically have him imprisoned, and then he was executed. And this took a toll on Plato, that this execution of his teacher, of this really, really well-liked person in Plato's life, kind of took a toll. And if you look at some of these letters that Plato writes in his time, which what I also found is that we don't know if that's entirely true, that some of these letters, the authorship is a bit weird. But if these are to be believed, that this death, the execution of his teacher, of his friend, kind of makes him very, very hesitant to go out into the public sphere. And I thought that was interesting. And he ends up after Socrates' death, he ends up traveling quite extensively. Again, depending if the authorship of these is actually Plato or not. But with Plato, he goes from Greece and he travels extensively around Greece. He goes to Italy and he does some pretty significant stuff around Italy, like in Sicily and Syracuse. And then he goes to Egypt, and Plato is also one of them that describes like Atlantis in one of his works. But he is around 40, and something that I found really interesting that I want to talk about is kind of this whole idea behind the philosopher king, which is probably one of my favorite parts of this book, this kind of 50-year education plan that Plato and Socrates come up with in the Republic. But when he's around 40, he goes and he tries to put this into practice. So he goes to Syracuse 3 times. The first time was, oh gosh, again, I don't have a year written down, but when he's about 40. And he gets there and he befriends, not really befriends, I guess, but gets to know the tyrant, stays with him, Dionysus, and then his brother-in-law, Dion of Syracuse, ends up kind of falling out of favor. Him and Socrates have this kind of argument, and then he's kicked out of Syracuse. But in 366, he's invited back because Dionysus I, that tyrant that he originally met, dies, and Dion of Syracuse, the uncle or the brother-in-law, invites Socrates back to teach and to tutor Dionysus II, kind of the next tyrant, the next heir of Syracuse, and tries to put into effect this philosopher king mentality. And it doesn't necessarily work out the best. Dionysus II ends up kind of not liking and developing this dislike for his uncle, for Dion of Syracuse, and kicks him out. Aristotle tries to make it better, tries to make them like each other, or just at least kind of fix that bridge, but it doesn't work, and he ends up leaving again. And then he returns for a third and final time in 361, and he's kind of held prisoner there. And eventually he leaves and he goes back to Athens. He kind of stays there about 360. He founds an academy, this big, he acquires some land outside of Athens, and it becomes kind of the precursor, one of the direct relatives or ancestors to our modern university system. And he has everything set up with like gymnasium and the different subjects that Plato talks about. Now, the actual book itself, so that's enough of Socrates. There's a ton you could get into with Socrates, but I don't want to dive too much into that because the book was really interesting. I am not a philosopher. I took one philosophy class in college and I did not do very well. So going back through, this is a really interesting book, and I thought it was a little bit more difficult read, so this is a great page. What I like about this edition is it has these notes that kind of give you a quick overview of what is going to be talked about in these sections. And they even break them down from the beginning of the parts and beginning to the chapters to even beginnings of sections. So this one is, part 7, book 6, part 2 of the qualities and character required for the philosopher. And the philosopher is shown to require, as philosopher, all the qualities that could be asked for in a good ruler. And so this edition was nice because I was able to read those and have a little bit better of an understanding going into the chapters, which, again, I really appreciated. I had a hard time following along in this book, but there are a few things that I have written down, basically 2 things that I really want to talk about that I appreciated, again, besides the allegory of the cave, but that's probably one of the best known allegories from Plato's time and Socrates and all of these guys. The first one is this 50-year education plan that Plato talks about in this, which I find very interesting. And in the past, 2,500 years, nobody's ever tried this. But this education plan, I'd be curious to see what it would be like in practice, because I know this book was pretty revolutionary philosophically and politically and socially for its time. These ideas that Plato had that he kind of projects with Socrates in this book to get out to the public. One of these things is the 50-year education plan to set up the philosopher king for kind of success in running this ideal state. And that's what all of this is based off of, is that this ideal state works. This is the person that you need to run this state. The other aspect of this I do want to talk about is Plato is very, very adamant men and women are equal, and that any differences between them are not dramatic or drastic enough to justify unequal treatment, which I find very interesting for the time period, 2,500 years ago. Really interesting. And I know the ancient civilizations had a much different outlook on gender roles than like medieval Europe, and like Middle Ages, the Islamic world, Asia, the Americas, and then all the way up until like the 1860s, 1920s, and up until now. But still, it's really interesting to see this idea from something over 2,000 years ago, almost 3,000 years ago. So I want to break down the 50-year plan really quick because I found it super interesting. And as a social studies teacher, just as a teacher in general in the education system, I thought this is a very interesting aspect, or very interesting educational idea, something that we don't do, but Plato has some ideas and some justifications for his plan behind it. So the very first thing that he talks about in this plan is early childhood up to 18. And the education kind of curricula for this is, how does he say it? Training in gymnastics, art, music, and elementary mathematics. That this is very much based on physical exercise and then some introduction to some more intellectual topics. These other kind of intellectual studies, maybe like the humanities, are lightly enforced. And Plato's defense for this, why early childhood to 18, where this isn't really rigidly enforced in a very prominent aspect of their education from this childhood into the late teen years, is because this really intense intellectual study could lead to the students rebelling. And this very intense and rigorous physical activity and exercise will do no harm to the body, and it's good for them overall, because these ideas and principles that you learn from this rigorous physical exercise and the study of art and the study of early math can only benefit you, and you can use those principles and ideas as you move further and further into more intellectual studies. That again, it's kind of the underlying skills that you learn, not the base level objectives that you're reaching for. He also says something very interesting, that students, once they kind of come to a certain age, are able to ride into battle with parents or family members or community members to see what warfare is like. And this goes along with step 2, but to see what warfare and what courage are like up close and in person, not just word of mouth storytelling. And again, this plays into step 2 because this 18 to probably about 20 to 21 is very, very strict. You kind of relax a bit more on any intellectual study. And these 2 to 3-ish years are solely based off of military service and physical education. And students are chosen. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that with this first part, this early childhood, that students, once they hit the age of 18, are basically tested and observed. And if they do not move on, not every student moves on in this system. If they don't, they basically just fill these kind of lower level positions, these kind of lower class things that need to be done within the ideal state to make everything run. And then the ones that are chosen move on to this kind of 18 to 20, 21 year physical education, military service age range. And then they're tested again at the end of this 2 to 3 years. And again, if they don't move on from this, if they're not chosen to continue into their 20s, they fill some different kind of second class roles to make sure that every aspect of this ideal society is filled and that this runs like a well-oiled machine. Around that 20 mark, after this really, really heavy focus on education and military service, students will move on to about a 10-year study program in mathematics, and they move in from this physical kind of military-based education over into a more predominantly rigid academic or intellectual based education system. And this lasts 10 years until they're about 30. They go through more testing from this stage on, or from this stage, that they are chosen or not chosen. And Plato in the book does not really discuss what these people who are not chosen necessarily do after this stage, where they're in about that late 20s, early 30s range. Most likely, they probably just again fill some different positions that lead up. They have this higher level of education, but they're not quite there to move on to this next bit 5-year period. So from 30 to about 35, students continue to study mathematics, but then they move into dialectics. And this, again, is pushed, and Plato really stresses here that dialectics need to be taken seriously, that it's not kind of a fun game or a joke that they're studying this, that this continues to lead up into who is going to run this ideal society in about 15 more years. Students are then tested and chosen again to move on, much like the previous section or part of this education system. These students just fill positions that need to be full to make sure society keeps running properly. At 35, Plato believes that these guys are well-trained philosophers, that these are mature individuals in this kind of education and intellectual sphere, but now they need the practical applications. They need the practical knowledge to make this work. They're not done yet, but they've done the education part of this. So now they get to go out and they get to be leaders in the state, in the military. They go into politics. And then they also use these next, what will it be? Again, about 10 to 15 years to train the next group of people coming up, these previous parts. And this is how they get that practical knowledge and these practical applications to then put into effect when they hit the age of about 50. Where at 50, they can actually live their lives, and they are the leaders of society and leaders of the military. And the reason why Plato emphasizes this so much is because these people should at this point know how to operate and how to make decisions within this state to do what's best for the people, not for them. That this isn't like kind of what politicians we see today. These are people that have been educated and very highly educated and trained. They've seen different aspects of life, not just politics, not just the aristocracy, but military, the nitty-gritty education. They know what people need to be taught. And this is what Plato hopes will make them really effective leaders, because they can see what people have gone through, because they've kind of checked all of these boxes within their own society, which I think is absolutely great. I think it's a really interesting idea, and I'm kind of surprised nobody has really ever tried it. And maybe I just don't know much about, kind of the progression of politics and education from this time that Plato wrote this and had this idea up until now. But I would be curious how it would turn out. Being basically a 50-year schooling would be strange, I think. But it's a cool concept. It's really, really interesting. I'd be curious how it would work in actual practice, because this, again, all revolves around the fact people are going to do what's best for this ideal state. And I think that's where we might miss a beat or two with this idea. The last thing I want to talk about, I know the video is getting a little long, but Plato's idea and emphasis on the roles of men and women, and that these differences between them are not dramatic enough to justify unequal treatment. One way that Plato describes this is by a lot of co-ed aspects of life, especially if they make it through this kind of military aspect of life. Men and women need to go through all of this training together, because to have this ideal society and perfectly harmonious group of people, everybody needs to be educated. And that is what's going to facilitate this harmony and equality. I thought I had one more kind of buzzword in there, but I am missing it. Now, they do this exact same training. Women can also be the guards of the guardians of society, kind of the soldiers. And what Plato discusses here, which I found really interesting and kind of where I'll leave this, is that they will all live together and they will do everything together. There will be no private families for the guardians. And again, this is a way that Plato describes to make sure that everybody's treated equally. And he says private families, these kind of closed off, secluded, familial sections, this is what leads to nepotism and corruption, division. That if everybody lives together, everybody shares these responsibilities as one group of people, that hopefully this ideal society can kind of mitigate that and not worry about these class hierarchies that allow people to move around based off of what their lineage is. So it's a tough read, I will say that. And again, that might just be me with kind of my schooling that I went through and not ever really breaking this down or breaking down who Plato was or what his beliefs were, and only knowing about him at a very, very base level, if that. I would recommend it. I think a lot of people probably should read this book, and break it down in like a study group or something. That this, I think, is a great way to educate people on different political and philosophical social ideologies. That this is probably something that we could use today, 2,000 years later. So I will leave this here, Plato's The Republic. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and bye.